An angry stranger stormed into the cafe, his voice cutting through the warm hum of conversation. His finger pointed directly at Barron Trump, his expression tight with frustration. What happened next would leave everyone questioning their own assumptions. It was a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. Inside, the cafe buzzed with casual chatter, the sound of clinking cups adding to the inviting atmosphere. At a small table near the window, Barron Trump sat with his tall frame slightly hunched over a thick book. He wasn't trying to draw attention. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he blended in, or at least he thought he did. Barron had come here for a simple reason: a moment of quiet. As the youngest son of a former president, his life had been a constant whirlwind of public appearances and scrutiny. But here, among strangers sipping lattes and scrolling through their phones, he felt an unusual sense of anonymity. He was engrossed in his book when a sharp voice cut through the cafe's murmur. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" Conversations stopped. Heads turned toward the source of the outburst. A man, likely in his late 40s, stood a few feet away from Barron's table. His weathered face was tense, his fiery expression full of resentment. He wasn't dressed poorly, but his clothes had the unmistakable wear and tear of someone who had faced hard times. His voice trembled with anger as he continued. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter. Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" The room tensed. Some exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The barista hesitated behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone, ready to call security if things escalated. Barron, however, remained calm. His composure was striking, a stark contrast to the man's intensity. He closed his book slowly, placing it gently on the table. Then, looking up at the man, he spoke. "Sir," Barron said, his voice steady but quiet, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly. "Talk?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What could you possibly say that someone like me would want to hear?" The cafe fell eerily silent. People held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But instead of matching the man's aggression, Barron did something that no one expected, something that would change everything. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but attentive. The anger in the man's eyes burned, but Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit," he said calmly. His tone was disarming. The unexpected offer took the man aback, and for a brief moment his shoulders tensed as if he were considering it, but his fists remained clenched. He stood there, glaring down at Barron. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you?" the man sneered. "You're just another spoiled kid who will never know what it's like to live in the real world." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whispers fluttered through the room. The barista made a subtle movement, as if weighing whether she should intervene. Barron, however, remained composed. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his voice measured. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." For a second, the man seemed to falter. There was no challenge in Barron's voice, only an invitation. Yet, instead of accepting the seat, the man leaned in closer, his voice lowering but still sharp. "You think I owe you my story?" he snapped. "You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" His words carried bitterness, as if a lifetime of hardship had built into this very moment. But Barron didn't waver. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he said gently. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, but something deeper. For the first time, he really looked at Barron, not as a name, not as a headline, but as a person. And in that instant, the entire cafe felt the weight of the moment, a moment of truth in a cafe. Dripping with sarcasm, the man sneered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Barron's face, looking for any reaction, any sign of weakness. But Barron's gaze didn't waver. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he said, his tone unwavering. His words hung in the air, slicing through the heavy tension that gripped the cafe. The man hesitated, as if torn between his instinct to lash out and the unexpected civility he was facing. The other customers, who had been quietly observing, now watched with a strange mix of curiosity and hope. No one knew where this was going, but they couldn't look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of an empty chair and dragged it noisily across the floor. With a heavy sigh, he dropped into the seat, crossing his arms defensively. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning Barron as if searching for a crack in his composure. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The atmosphere in the cafe shifted. The tension wasn't entirely gone, but it was no longer suffocating. The barista behind the counter lowered her hand from the phone, still cautious but sensing the conversation had taken a different turn. The patrons leaned in slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop, yet hanging on every word. Barron nodded, leaning forward just a bit. "I'm listening," he said simply. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if trying to steady himself before speaking. His voice, though quieter now, still carried the weight of years of struggle. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything." His words were heavy with bitterness. He glanced around the cafe, as if daring anyone to challenge him, before locking eyes with Barron once again. "I had a job, a family, a decent life, and then the factory I worked at shut down. Just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but broken promises that they'd relocate us, promises that never came true." The cafe was silent, except for the soft hiss of the espresso machine in the background. The man's voice began to crack as he continued. His tough exterior was crumbling, piece by piece. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, took whatever odd jobs I could find, but when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you." He paused, his eyes glistening, as if fighting off tears he had long since learned to swallow. "My wife, she left, took the kids with her, said she couldn't live like this anymore." His voice wavered, the weight of his confession settling over the room like a heavy fog. "I can't even blame her." Barron remained silent, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the empathy in his eyes. The man's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, as if trying to find some anchor in the chaos of his life. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing?" His voice was raw, filled not just with anger, but with deep, unshakable pain. The words hit hard, not just for Barron, but for everyone listening. A woman at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly engrossed in her coffee, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly, his frustration spilling out. "Sitting here, in your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me mad. Because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. Barron didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he let the man's pain settle, respecting its weight. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Barron said softly, "but I do know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word." The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What could you possibly know about that?" Barron's response wasn't what anyone expected. It shifted the conversation and the entire mood of the cafe in a way no one could have predicted. He took a deep breath, his steady composure making the tension in the room feel less suffocating. He met the man's skeptical glare, his expression unwavering. "You might think I've got it easy because of my name. And in some ways, you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table." The man scoffed, ready to interrupt, but Barron held up a hand, not in a dismissive way, but as if to say, "Just listen." "That doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood," Barron continued, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the entire cafe lean in closer. For the first time since the man had stormed in, he didn't have a retort. Instead, he watched Barron closely, something shifting in his expression, and for the first time it felt like he was truly listening. An unexpected conversation that changed everything. The man looked ready to interrupt, but Barron lifted a hand, not in a dismissive way, but as if to say, "Hear me out." "Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me," Barron said, his voice calm yet firm. "They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done. just because of my last name. But they don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto, kind of like what's happening here. The man's face twitched, as if Barron's words had hit a nerve. He didn't speak, but his posture shifted ever so slightly. His arms loosened from their defensive cross, his shoulders relaxing just a little. Barron, sensing the shift, continued, his tone measured but genuine. I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours. They're not, Barron admitted. But pain is pain. Feeling like you're invisible, like you'll never be understood. That's something we all face, no matter where we come from. The cafe fell into complete silence, the kind that felt thick with thought. Even the barista had stopped mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb what had just been said. I'm not here to argue with you, Barron added after a beat. I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees. And maybe we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did. The man's jaw tightened, his fingers clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, but then he exhaled sharply, as if releasing something heavy he had been holding onto for too long. You really believe that? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Barron nodded. I do. And I think maybe, deep down, you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told me your story. The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking just a little more. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe, as if noticing for the first time just how many people were watching. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but then he looked back at Barron. You're not what I expected, he admitted, his tone softer now. But the real surprise wasn't what Barron said next. It was what the man did in response. He sat back in his chair, his body language shifting from guarded to contemplative. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The cafe was still, every patron caught in the quiet tension of the moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier hostility. You know, I came in here mad at the world, he said, shaking his head. Mad at people like you, who I thought had it all handed to them. He let out a low, almost bitter chuckle, running a hand through his graying hair. But maybe I've been carrying that anger too long. Maybe it's not about you at all. Barron didn't respond right away. Fine, he muttered. You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted. The tension wasn't entirely gone, but it was no longer suffocating. The barista behind the counter lowered her hand from the phone, still cautious, but sensing the conversation had taken a different turn. The patrons leaned in slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop, yet hanging on every word. Barron nodded, leaning forward just a bit. I'm listening, he said simply. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if trying to steady himself before speaking. His voice, though quieter now, still carried the weight of years of struggle. You look at me and see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything. His words were heavy with bitterness. He glanced around the cafe, as if daring anyone to challenge him, before locking eyes with Barron once again. I had a job, a family, a decent life, and then the factory I worked at shut down. Just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but broken promises that they'd relocate us, promises that never came true. The cafe was silent, except for the soft hiss of the espresso machine in the background. The man's voice began to crack as he continued. His tough exterior was crumbling, piece by piece. I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, took whatever odd jobs I could find, but when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you. He paused, his eyes glistening, as if fighting off tears he had long since learned to swallow. My wife, she left, took the kids with her, said she couldn't live like this anymore. His voice wavered, the weight of his confession settling over the room like a heavy fog. I can't even blame her. Barron remained silent, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the empathy in his eyes. The man's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, as if trying to find some anchor in the chaos of his life. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing? His voice was raw, filled not just with anger, but with deep, unshakable pain. And then he was gone. As the door closed behind the man, the cafe seemed to collectively exhale, releasing the tension that had filled the air moments before. Conversation slowly resumed, but something had changed. There was a new energy in the room, a quiet understanding that lingered among strangers who had just witnessed something remarkable. Barron returned to his seat, picked up his book, and took a sip of his now cold tea. He was ready to retreat into solitude, but before he could, a woman from a nearby table approached him. She appeared to be in her 60s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Young man," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentle sincerity, "I just want to say what you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Barron nodded, his expression humble. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied. "I think we all just want to be heard." The woman smiled before returning to her seat, leaving Barron to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a renewed sense of connection. Patrons smiled at one another, struck up conversations, and exchanged small gestures of kindness, holding doors, sharing warm glances, even picking up each other's tabs. The ripple effect of one moment of empathy had spread through the room, changing its atmosphere entirely. By the time Barron stepped outside, the world felt a little lighter. The sky was the same, the streets were just as busy, but something intangible had shifted. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been part of that moment. The man's anger, Barron's empathy, and the simple act of listening had sparked a quiet transformation, a reminder of the power of understanding and compassion. As Barron walked down the sidewalk, he couldn't shake the thought of how small actions could leave such a big impact. He didn't know the man's full story, and he probably never would. But for those few moments in that cafe, they had connected, and that connection had changed the entire tone of the room. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes, Barron thought to himself. Just a little bit of empathy to remind us we're not so different after all. This story isn't just about Barron or the man he met that day. It's about all of us, the way we carry our struggles, the way we judge others, and the way we can choose to listen instead of react. If this story moved you, take a moment today to practice a little kindness. And if you'd like more stories like this one, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's spread a little more understanding, one story at a time.